Well, good afternoon or morning, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Developing the Passport Learning Outcomes and Proficiency Criteria for Quantitative Literacy. I'm Kate Springsteen, Member Services Coordinator for the Interstate Passport Program. This webinar is being recorded and will be made available at interstatepassport.wiche.edu/webinars by tomorrow, November 3rd. If you have questions throughout the webinar, please type your question into the box under the GoToWebinar panel and it will be brought to the presenter's attentions. Following this webinar, I will be sending out an email with information on where to find the recording of this webinar as well as a link to a survey which we would very much appreciate if you would fill out. I'm delighted to introduce you to our presenters for today's webinar, Jonathan Bodrero and Bob Turner. Jonathan is an associate professor of mathematics at Snow College. He earned his bachelor's and master's degrees from Brigham Young University and has been teaching full-time at Snow for 17 years. In addition to the WICHE Interstate Passport project, Jonathan has experience with outcomes-based assessment as he chaired the Math GE tuning team for Utah and currently serves as institution point person for the AAC&U Multi-State Collaborative to advance quality student learning. He is also involved in the creation of an OER text aligned to the math core standards for grades 6 through 8. Bob Turner retired in June 2011 after 4 years as Oregon University System Assistant Vice Chancellor for Academic Standards and Collaborations. He worked with Oregon's public universities, statewide faculty senate, and K-12 and community college leadership on student learning and student transitions among educational institutions. Bob received a BS in biology from Seattle University and a PhD in embryology from the University of Oregon, and taught and conducted biology research for over 30 years. He is an emeritus professor of biology at Western Oregon University, where he was honors program director and interim dean of liberal arts and sciences. Welcome, Jonathan and Bob.
Thank you. This is Jonathan.
And this is Bob. Thank you very much, Kate. So we're going to start this conversation or this webinar by taking a look at what the Interstate Passport is, and then we'll have Jonathan lead us through a discussion of how the learning outcomes and proficiency criteria for quantitative literacy were established. The Interstate Passport is a new framework that's intended to reduce the friction that's involved in student transfer from one institution to another. It's a grassroots initiative. It originated with academic leaders. It focuses on lower division education and consists of a block transfer of learning outcomes and proficiency criteria. These were developed by multi-state faculty negotiation, and one of those sets of learning outcome and proficiency criteria is the topic of today's webinars. In addition, the Interstate Passport has a mechanism for tracking student academic progress. This was designed by registrars and institutional researchers. The next slide shows the goal of the Interstate Passport. Its goal is to reduce the unnecessary repetition of academic work after students transfer. This is anticipated to lead to improved graduation rates, to shorten the time to degree, to save students money. While this is going on, the Passport keeps a focus on ensuring quality, and it streamlines the pathway to graduation. There were several decisions that were made while the Passport was being designed. The Passport is intended to be interstate. This meant that we needed to have the Passport focus on an academic program that is common to all states. That's clearly general education. If we were to approach an interstate general education transfer initiative based on courses, we could anticipate this would end up looking something like an airline flight map. Many nodes, many lines going between and among different institutions. So we decided to focus not on courses, but on learning outcomes. This focus on learning outcomes eased the process of developing a cross-border match between institutions that wish to participate in the Passport. So in addition to these two general education and learning outcomes design decisions, there were a couple of design principles that were involved in leading to the Passport. The first of these, based on a lot of experience, told us that we need to honor institutional individuality. We cannot ask institutions to change wholesale the way they're going about educating students. The second design principle is that each element of the passport has been designed and developed by those who will operationalize it. Faculty concerned with the academic learning outcomes proficiency criteria. Registrars and institutional researchers are concerned with the tracking mechanism after the students have transferred, and academic advisors are concerned with the parts of the passport that have to do with letting the student know about the passport and its advantages. The passport consists of several different components. The first was decided by the passport state facilitators, one for each passport state, and passport staff. What learning outcome, what areas are going to be involved in the passport? These are lower division, general education. The second and third portions of the passport were developed by faculty by a mechanism that is going to be described by Jonathan a little bit later. These consist of a set of learning outcomes for each of the lower division areas and a set of proficiency criteria for each of the learning outcomes. In addition to the first three elements of the passport, there is a block of passport courses and learning experiences put together by the faculty at each institution. And there's a tracking system developed by registrars and institutional researchers that keeps track of student academic progress. The passport also has an application and a memorandum of agreement that is signed by each of the passport institutions. And the final component of the passport is a passport review board consisting of representatives from each of the passport states and passport staff. And this review board meets annually to track the progress of the passport and to deal with any issues that may come up. The development of the passport has been funded by the Carnegie Corporation of New York, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and the Lumina Foundation, and grants from the First in the World Department of Education grant process. So the first component of the passport is the general education learning areas that are involved. These have been developed from the LEAP Essential Learning Outcomes and also from research by WICHE on those general education areas that are common to the WICHE states. There are three foundational skills levels: oral communication, written communication, and quantitative literacy. In addition, there are four areas that entail knowledge of concepts in creative expression, natural science, human cultures, and human society and the individual. And finally, there are two areas that involve cross-cutting skills: critical thinking and teamwork and value systems. The next slide shows the learning and an illustration of the passport learning outcomes and proficiency criteria. The learning outcomes, which are common to all of the passport institutions, are statements of what the student must know and or be able to do to attain lower division general education proficiency. For example, for quantitative literacy, one of those learning outcomes is to recognize, evaluate, and use quantitative information, quantitative reasoning, and technology to support a position or a line of reasoning. Each of these learning outcomes has a set of proficiency criteria associated with it. The proficiency criteria are simply statements of assignments that are currently being used for students to show transfer level proficiency with the learning outcome. These are illustrations, or these are examples of assignments. One of those assignments that addresses quantitative literacy is that a student employs proportional reason to explain why a subpopulation is over or underrepresented in a sample. The next slide shows the learning outcomes for quantitative literacy. The left-hand column of this table shows a very brief statement of different features of quantitative literacy: computational skills, communication of quantitative arguments, analysis, formulation of quantitative arguments, the mathematical process, and quantitative models. Each of these features has an associated learning outcome. This is what the student has learned. The first of these, computational skills, the student demonstrates proficiency with arithmetic and algebraic computational skills and extends them, for example, to geometric and statistical computations. And each of the features has corresponding learning outcomes. It's very important to understand and to appreciate that the Passport learning outcomes are common to every Passport institution. They are acceptable to every Passport institution. They're not necessarily expressed identically in identical language at each institution, but each institution agrees that these learning outcomes are the learning outcomes that with which a student must attain transfer level proficiency. And the next slide shows a corresponding transfer level proficiency criteria for one of those learning outcomes. The learning outcome feature of computational skills. The student must correctly solve problems or equations at the appropriate level. Proficiency criteria are illustrations or examples of and not requirements of activities that different faculty use to achieve proficiency with a particular learning outcome. For the learning outcome that's in this table, one of the ways that some faculty go about achieving proficiency with this learning outcome is that the student can demonstrate that they correctly compute the mean, the median, the mode, and standard deviation for a given numerical data set. A different faculty member at a different institution may use the ability of the student to find the area or volume of general geometric objects by decomposing them into more basic components. Each of these proficiency criteria accomplish the same thing. They demonstrate that the student can correctly solve problems or equations at an appropriate level. And these are, again, examples and not requirements. And finally, the fourth component of the Passport is a Passport block. A Passport block is a set of learning experiences that the student uses at a particular institution to achieve proficiency with all of the learning outcomes for that particular area. In the case of quantitative literacy, with the 6 features that are listed in the left column and the 6 learning outcomes, one for each feature, the faculty at each institution will put together a set of courses or other learning experiences that will be used to deliver proficiency at the transfer level with each of the learning outcomes. These Passport blocks are anticipated to be unique to each institution. So the individuality of each institution is honored and is maintained, even though the institutions agree on and accept the learning outcomes. So these are the components of the Passport that are important for this particular webinar. I would like to ask if there are any questions. And Kate?
Hi, Bob.
Are there questions?
Yeah,
Yep.
we have a couple of questions. The first question is are there a certain number of credits that students must have to meet the quantitative literacy learning outcomes?
If one goes to the Passport block slide, the previous slide, you'll notice that the block is unique to each institution. This says that each institution is going to determine the number of courses and therefore the number of credits that are necessary to accomplish proficiency with the learning outcomes. So the short answer is no, there is not a defined number of credits. It's the number of credits that are necessary at that institution for the students to achieve proficiency at the transfer level with the learning outcomes.
Thanks. The second question is related. It's how do you ensure that the learning outcomes are actually being met?
That is, there are 2 ways. Number one is that we are asking that each institution is assuming that their fellow Passport institutions are are getting the students to become proficient with the learning outcomes. However, that trust component of the passport is supplemented by tracking. So after a student transfers, the passport has a mechanism for keeping track of how well the student performs at the new institution. If they are proficiency with the learning outcomes, they should perform at a level that is consistent with native students of that institution. So we trust that each institution is getting students proficient with the learning outcomes, but we're also going to track the success of the students after they transfer.
Thanks, Bob. Those are the only 2 questions we have right now, but if you have any more questions, please submit them through the questions box on the GoToWebinar panel, and I'll present them to the presenters during the next round of questions.
So I would like, go ahead, Jonathan.
All right, I'm a faculty member, and so I want to look at this from the faculty point of view and kind of step you through our process and how you can be part of the process too. So just a quick reminder, so we have our lower division general education outcomes and our proficiency criteria. Again, the passport learning outcomes are more of the broad statements, and they were written to be broad on purpose so that we could achieve them in a variety of different ways and give each school some flexibility. And so, for example, one of them, as Bob alluded to earlier, is the formulation of quantitative arguments. That's kind of the overall arching one, and then we give a description of that, and then we manifest that through the proficiency criteria. So these are the specific ways, instances that students may meet that. Now, these are just samples, they're illustrations of how they may do it. At each institution, it may be different, but they need to have a concrete, specific way that they meet those general passport learning outcomes. So for example, in formulation of quantitative arguments, the student may employ proportional reasoning to explain why the subpopulation is over or underrepresented in the sample. So that is a specific way. It's not the required way. It's one possible way that students may show that they've mastered that learning outcome. So how did we get there? Well, first off, each state met within the state between their 2-year and 4-year schools and came up with what we felt were our general education learning outcomes for quantitative literacy. Then we got together and in Colorado did a crosswalk and interstate negotiation where we compared each state's list looking for similarities. Now, it wasn't a carbon copy from state to state to state. We did have to negotiate through some differences, but we were pretty common, and it was not too difficult to synthesize a summary of our outcomes. So we did that, then we created a crosswalk, and then went back to our states to get feedback and buy-in from our constituents, our colleagues. And then we further negotiated this through some conference calls and making sure that everybody is on board. And then the Passport Review Board, again, monitors us and gives us feedback and checks on how we're doing. So the initial group that got together were from 5 different states and 8 faculty, myself included. And so you can see that we had California, Oregon, Utah, North Dakota, and Hawaii. And another thing that's really important to note is that we had institutions of various types. I worked at a 2-year school, but we had 2-year and 4-year schools represented. So it's not just 2 years saying this is what general education is and you 4-year schools need to deal with it, or vice versa. It was a real collaboration between 2- and 4-year schools. And so you can see that we did have 2-year schools and 4-year schools. So what did we do at that meeting in Colorado? Well, we took a look at each of our learning outcomes that each state brought, and you can see an example here of the crosswalk. And highlighted in red, you can see one commonality that was manifest throughout all the GE learning outcomes for the states. And so we looked at that, and it's basically getting that quantitative information and support and critiquing. And so we work that into a mutually agreed upon learning outcome, which was the passport learning outcome. And we did that with each of the various aspects until we could get something that everybody was fairly happy with. Okay, so again, the timeline, before you come together, each state needs to find out what their learning outcomes are, bring that to the meeting, sit down, have the negotiations, work through any difficulties. And then we created a draft version in October. We sent it out for feedback and made some minor modifications and finalized those passport learning outcomes. And again, it's through interstate negotiation. Okay. So the passport learning outcomes were negotiated and finalized, and here is what it looked like when we were all done. Then we turned our attention to the proficiency criteria. So how does a student manifest that they've actually met these learning outcomes? Well, we worked on those proficiency criteria in the spring of 2013. We came up with a variety of examples. And one thing that I want to stress here is use things that you are already using. They may need a minor tweak, but you don't have to reinvent the wheel. So we had many examples. Most of them we accepted of certain things that people were already doing. A couple were like, we're not quite sure that exactly addresses, but the majority of things, vast majority of things that people were already doing in their GE level courses were worked in and highlighted as possible proficiency criteria, ways that students could demonstrate their mastery of that, or their proficiency with the material. So we continue to work on that through the spring and summer of 2013 to work on our draft, finalizing that through some conference calls and again, some more negotiations. One thing that's really cool about this is it gives the institutions their own individuality. They can address those learning outcomes in whichever way they feel best. Okay, so let's look at some specific proficiency criteria. So in the computational skills area, a student needs to correctly solve problems or equations at the appropriate level. They can do that maybe in a statistics class with the mean, median, and mode and standard deviation for a data set and telling what they are, or rearranging the margin of error formula so we can find the sample size we need to get a good confidence interval. Again, we mentioned the geometric arguments, or down here on the bottom, you'll see that it's not exclusively in the domain of mathematics. So maybe an institution decides to use a chemistry class as part of their block of courses that demonstrates that the student has mastered quantitative literacy. In this example, in the lower right corner, the student uses the ideal gas law to compute how one variable is affected when another one is changed. Are there any questions at this point?
Jonathan, I just have one question. If a student comes in with a passport and is a math major, how do we ensure they have the correct prerequisites for their math major?
Very good. Excellent question. Thank you. Again, the passport deals mostly with general education, or primarily with general education. So if a student takes the general education class and gets the passport from, say, Utah and transfers to North Dakota, they will have fulfilled their quantitative literacy general education in North Dakota. Now, that doesn't preclude them from taking math classes that they need for their major, whether it's a math major or even a science major. It's focusing on the general education. So it's the general education. They still have to meet the major requirements at the transfer institution, but the passport is to help reduce the friction and repetition of general education level classes.
Great. Thanks, Jonathan. Those are all the questions I have right now.
Okay. Let me just talk briefly a little bit about the challenges and opportunities that we had. Okay, well, first off, the challenges. You're going to have to negotiate between disparate institutions with different missions, different identities, goals. For example, in California, they're a big system. In Utah, we're a small system. We only have two two-year schools and a number of four-year schools. It was, not too difficult to get a representative from each of our schools in our state together. I know it will be harder in states such as California. Another one is that we need to recognize that the learning outcomes are fairly consistent and they're not really in conflict. They may be doing different things in different states or addressing them in slightly different ways, but the overall goal for learning outcomes for the student for quantitative literacy are usually fairly close. Again, recognize that the proficiency criteria are merely examples, illustrations of the assignments that we now use. They are not the only measuring sticks that you can use to demonstrate that students have met those. They are illustrations of ways that students can meet the learning outcome, just to give you a flavor and for what we're trying to get at. Okay, make sure that we're all at the right level. Okay, there were many opportunities throughout this process. One of the best ones was to network, both intra and interstate and between 2- and 4-year institutions. Talking shop with these other people, you get to see different challenges and different solutions to those challenges in a variety of different areas, something that might, spark something at your own school. Another one is talking about real student learning with our colleagues. So what is it that students need to know and do to be able to successfully master the material? And what is it that we expect them to do? And I've taken the learning outcomes and put them on my course syllabi so that the students know exactly up front, day one, what are the major goals for this course and how they're going to be assessed. And that has helped cut down on questions about, well, why did I pass or why didn't I pass your class? Well, let's see. Did you meet these goals and these learning outcomes for the course? Well, no. Well, that answers the question. So that's what we talked about, what the students need to know and do. And another cool thing is we can realize that there are many more similarities than differences among our institutions. And this does allow us to measure student proficiency and report out to our stakeholders. Something that education is being called on for more accountability. And this is one way to help address that. All right, I'd like to turn it back over to Bob to talk about how you can become a passport institution.
Thanks very much, Jonathan. A very clear explanation of how the proficiency criteria and learning outcomes were established. Becoming a passport institution is a 6-step process. In the first place, the faculty at each institution need to examine the passport learning outcomes and recognize that they are consistent with the learning outcomes that the institution may have. Again, as Jonathan stated, they don't need to be identical, but they need to be congruent and not in conflict with internal learning outcomes. Once that has been accomplished, the faculty needs to put together courses or other learning opportunities that provide the opportunity for students to demonstrate proficiency with all of the learning outcomes. That having been accomplished, the administration at each institution then needs to apply for passport status and sign the memorandum of agreement so that they are now a member of the passport network. Having become a member of the passport network, it is now the job of the advisors and marketers at the institution to inform and advise students about the passport. What is it? How do I make use of it? And what are its advantages to me? And how do I complete it at my institution? Once the passport has been completed at an institution, the registrar then needs to award the student the passport. We've found that this is most effectively done on an automatic basis rather than having students have to apply to get a passport. Once the student has been awarded a passport and decides and actually transfers to a new institution, that new institution needs to track the academic progress of passport students, and that tracking information is made available both to the new institution and to the institution from which the student transferred. And I neglected to point out earlier that this tracking mechanism is something that is conducted by the National Student Clearinghouse. It's a component of the passport quality assurance piece. And the next slide shows 5 different ways that quality assurance is accomplished by the passport. The first is that each component of the passport requires a minimum grade of C. This is not an overall C average for all pieces of the passport. Each individual component of the passport block must be passed with a grade of C or better. The academic progress tracking of students after they transfer is accomplished by the National Student Clearinghouse. The National Student Clearinghouse has interacted with the development of the passport, and they have set up an automated system for institutions to submit the students' academic progress and for the reports to be furnished to the institutions by the National Student Clearinghouse. There is also a pilot study going on in which a 2-year and a 4-year institution in each of Colorado, Montana, and New Mexico and NCHEMS are mapping the extent to which critical assignments map to specific learning outcomes. So the question is, are the assignments really addressing the learning outcomes? A fourth quality assurance piece is a research study. And in this study, being conducted by the Education and Employment Research Center at Rutgers, the passport is being examined in detail. That is, how many students are involved, what is their transfer rate, their success rate, interviews of students and of advisors and registrars as to the effectiveness and the operation of the passport. And finally, the Passport Review Board monitors the efficacy of the passport and is a device is a body by means of which changes to the passport, if they seem to be indicated, can be accomplished. So now comes the question, why should we become a passport institution? Well, in the first place, the passport does facilitate transfer across state lines and within states. It eliminates a major obstacle to transfer student success, that is the loss of credits, and it also eliminates the necessity for institutions to review changes in lower division course requirements that are involved, and those changes in articulation agreements. So because the learning outcomes remain consistent, and it doesn't matter how the institution gets the students proficient with the learning outcomes, nor does it matter what changes an institution might make. Fellow passport institutions do not need to monitor those changes in courses. The passport also focuses on quality for positive impact on completion. It's based on what students should learn and should be able to apply, rather than seat time and number of credits and number of credit hours. It generates data on academic success after transfer, and that data can be used for continuous self-improvement, and it can be used to demonstrate to outsiders, the public, legislators, that the transfer mechanism is working for this passport. The passport also adapts to higher education's changing landscape. It embraces unique assessments that are determined by each department, program, or institution, and the department, program, and institution changes in those assessments as they work through student progress. And it includes the ability to include non-course-based educational experiences as mechanisms of accomplishing the passport learning outcomes. For example, an individual with experience in the military may have accomplished already the writing requirements for the passport or the quantitative literacy requirements, and may not be necessary for them to take additional coursework in order to demonstrate proficiency with those learning outcomes. And finally, being a member of the Passport Network provides the opportunity, the authority to issue a passport. It's a tool that recognizes a particular step of student achievement. These students are now proficient at the transfer level, and it can be taken as a mark of student achievement. And it can also be used as a recruiting tool. Our institution is one of the institutions that is involved in the Passport Network that simplifies and expedites student transfer without loss of previous educational experiences or credits. And I would finally like to say that there are a set of resources that are available. There are handbooks, one for faculty on constructing the institution's passport block, another for registrars and institutional researchers on how to go about tracking the academic progress of students, and finally a handbook for marketing, communication staff and academic advisors as to ways to advise students of the availability of the passport and how to go about, how the students might go about achieving a passport. So I now turn this back over to Kate, and I thank each of you for attending the webinar and welcome your questions, and hope that you have learned how the quantitative literacy learning outcomes and proficiency criteria have been developed.
Well, thank you and Bob for giving this great webinar, and thank you for everyone attending. There currently are no questions, but if you think of a question later on, please feel free to contact us. Our contact information is on the lower part of the screen. You could also go to our website, and there are a number of resources, as Bob mentioned, there as well. At the beginning of this webinar, I said that I would be sending out a survey, and I will do that after this webinar ends. I will also let you know where you can find a recording of this webinar. And with that, thanks again for everyone and attending, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.
Thanks, Kate. And Jonathan.
Thanks, Kate and Bob.
All right, bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.